Now that you have a static version of the counter component in place, let's go ahead and actually integrate component state. In order to do that, we know there are a few steps we need to take, and to jog our memories, I've actually taken a screenshot of the slide we saw 2 videos ago, and you can pull this up by visiting this URL. We want to make sure to hit all 5 points. Step 1 being to set up a default state object. So we want to pick all of the state properties we need. In our case, it is just going to be count. We're going to pick a good default value, and we're going to make sure we can render that default value to the screen. So that'll be step 1 and step 2. Now that means for us, we're going to have 0 showing up here or whatever default value we happen to want to use. Now, how do we set up that default state object? Well, this actually happens right inside of the constructor function. So all we're going to do down below is set up this dot state. This dot state, when we set it like we are here, is equivalent to what we did in the ES6 classes videos, where we set properties like this dot major or this dot age. So we're going to set this dot state equal to an object, and on this object, we're going to define all of the pieces of state we want to track. In our case, there is just one piece of changing data. It is the count. And we're going to go ahead and start this off at 0. So there we have it. That is step 1, setting up the default state object. Step 2 is to make sure that when the component renders, it actually uses those values. So let's go ahead and use it. How are we going to do that? We're just going to customize the render method. I'm going to try to put the count right here by creating a JavaScript expression. And we want to access this dot state. We literally just set up an object on there, and we want to access the one attribute we added onto that object, count. So this dot state dot count. Now, if we go ahead and save the counter example file, what do we get? We get 0 showing up to the screen, which is actually really great. If I change 0 to 12 and save the file again, we're going to see 12 showing up. So at this point, we do indeed have a piece of state, and we are indeed seeing it when we first render the component. Now, for real, this is going to be 0, so let's go ahead and switch that back. We don't want to start out the count at any other value. We want to make sure we always start out at 0. With steps 1 and 2 complete, we can move on to step 3. Step 3 is to actually change the state based off of some event. We already have 3 buttons. We already have 3 event handlers, so we're just going to go ahead and wire one of those up. Now, we know that this dot state is an object, but when we're trying to update the state, we do not just update that object. It is not going to work as expected. So let's go ahead and explore that. We're going to start by wiring up handle add 1. Now, we referenced off the object directly, so we might think that changing the object directly is also what we're going to do. This dot state dot count, setting it equal to this dot state dot count plus 1. And to prove the object actually changed, we can go ahead and log it. Console.log this dot state. Now, if we run this, we can click +1 a few times, and we can see in the console that the count is indeed going up. So the object is changing. The problem is that the component isn't re-rendering itself. So when we're working with our class-based components and we want to change the state, we do not just manually update the object. Instead, there is a method we call on our component instance. It is this dot set state. Set state is going to allow us to manipulate that state object. And then when we're done manipulating it, we are going to see the component refresh automatically. This is where things get a little tricky. So we're going to call this dot set state as a function because it is one. So we're going to toss on our parentheses, and it actually gets called with a single argument that is going to be a function. And this function is where we're going to define the updates we want to make. So how do we define those updates? We just return an object. So right here, we're going to return an object, and we specify the various state values we want to change and the new value we want to assign. So in our case, we just have one piece of state, count. So I'm going to go ahead and change count. I'm going to set count equal to 1. Now, that's not incrementing it. It is just statically changing it, but this should give us a good idea as to how it works. If we click +1, we should see the count go to 1, even though we won't be able to get past 1. I'm going to save counter example. I'm going to click that +1 button, and right away we can see we do get the count equal to 1. So the state is correctly getting manipulated, and we are also refreshing the component. If I keep clicking +1, obviously it always stays at 1 since we statically defined that number. So let's go ahead and take things a step further. Instead of having the value always set to 1, let's go ahead and get the old value, increment it by 1, and use that. Now, when we're inside of our little updater function, this function right here, we actually have access to the current state values via the first argument, which is commonly called previous state, though it's a function argument, so you could technically name it anything you like. This is our state object before your changes have been applied. So if you want to use a previous state value, all you do is you name this argument prev state, and then you access it. So if I want to set the new count based off of the old count right here, I would access previous state, which is our state object. I would get the count, the current count value, and I would go ahead and add 1 to it right here, +1. Now, if I go ahead and save the program, I should be able to click +1 indefinitely. I'm going to go check things out. Clicking +1, each time I click it, the count does indeed get updated, and it also refreshes things on the screen. So there we have it. We have set up our very first piece of component state. We have set up our default object. We watched that default state get rendered to the screen. We then changed the state based off an event. We watched those changes show up, and then we continued that loop. We clicked the +1 button again, changing the state again, and every single time we changed the state, the browser updated to reflect the new state values. So that is steps 1 through 5. That is all 5 steps necessary. Now, I'm sure you have more questions than you have answers, so let's try to talk about some common things related to this .set state that cause confusion. First up, if you have multiple pieces of state on your component, you do not have to provide them all here. You only provide the ones that you want to change. So let's say we have another piece of state. I'm going to call this one name, and I'll just set it equal to some name. And we're going to get it rendered to the screen so we can confirm its value right here inside of a JavaScript expression, this.state.name. Now, if I save the program, I would expect the count to be 0 and the name to be Julie, and that does indeed show up. But when I click +1, you'll notice that the count changes, but Julie still stays the same. So when we're defining the updates in our set state updater function, we're not overriding the state object completely. We are just changing specific values. In this case, I am just changing the count value. I leave off name here, so name isn't changed. It is not wiped. It stays exactly as it was before. Now, we're not actually going to set up a name property, so we can go ahead and remove the default name state, and we'll remove its usage down below inside of render. I just wanted to make you aware that the values provided here are updating that state object. They are not replacing it. I'm going to save the file and get back to our working application. And now it's your turn to use component state. Your challenge for this video is to wire up handle -1. We're not going to worry about handle reset. There is a special topic I want to talk about related to that. So we're just going to wire up this one for your challenge. Now your challenge is to call this.set state, and you are going to decrement the count by 1. So you're going to grab the previous state inside of your updater function. You're going to return an object, and you're going to manipulate that count, getting the previous count and subtracting 1 from it. Doing that is going to show the count decrease every time you click -1. So that is how you are going to test your work. Take some time to knock this out using the tools and techniques we just covered. And when you're done, go ahead and click play. All right, the goal here is to decrement the count by 1, so we're going to go ahead and do just that. When we want to change component state, we use this.set state. Now, what are we trying to do? We're trying to update it, so we define an updater function. The updater function lets us return an object, and on this object, we can define the state values that we actually want to tweak. In our case, we just have 1, and we want to tweak it, so we're going to go ahead and provide it, count. Now, what do we want to set count equal to? Well, we want to get the current count, and we want to subtract 1. If we want to access the current state values, we have to define prev state. This is going to allow us to access it down below. So we're going to set count equal to the previous state count, and we're going to go ahead and subtract 1. And there we have it. That is all we need to do in order to decrement the state by 1. I'm going to go ahead and save the counter example file, and then we can play around with it over inside of the program. I'm going to click +1 to get up to 5, and then -1, and we can see we can click -1, and the state does indeed decrement, automatically re-rendering the application as the state value changes. Now that we have handle add 1 and handle -1 in place, we can go ahead and fill out handle reset. Handle reset is going to call this .set state. We're going to pass in our updater function, And in this case, we actually don't need to define previous state because we don't really care what it is. We're going to be setting the count to 0 regardless. So we'll just return our object. Return an object where count is 0. If I did need the previous state, I would just name that argument and I would use it in whatever way I happened to need to, like up above where we grab it and -1 or add 1 to the value. Now that is it for handle reset. We can go ahead and save counter example. We can click +1, we can click -1, we get to a non-zero number, we click reset, and it brings us right back to 0. Everything is working really well. So there we have it. We have our 3 methods. All of them are correctly updating the state. Not only are we updating the state object, we can prove that because the value is getting changed, it's also automatically getting re-rendered. Now in the next video, I want to take a quick moment to talk about a different way we can use this .setState. We're going to talk about exactly what it is and why you shouldn't use it. For now though, we are all done, so I will see you in the next one.